I'm very pleased to address this 5th China and International Development Forum, looking at the question of development lending and debt sustainability. I'm sorry that I'm unable to join you physically, but I'm keen to do so at a future date, and I hope this video will be useful. What's the issue that China most needs to work on in its approach to development lending? What is the area which China could lead the world on if it gets it right, but if it gets it wrong, could be a critical element in the failure of Chinese lending to boost development and secure a legacy of genuine impact for itself and for the countries with which it works? Tantalizing question. The clue's in the title of this talk: How China can help strengthen public institutions, principles for development lending in the 21st century. What is the purpose of development lending? Luckily, that's an easy one to answer. Development. But what is development? How do we define it? Poverty reduction, certainly. Structural transformation so that countries take off, industrialize, are empowered to engage in the global economy. Yes, definitely. But underpinning both of those objectives, and any others you may be thinking of, is what I consider the absolute heart of it all: the gradual strengthening of public institutions to continue to deliver services and goods for a country long after a particular debt is paid or grant is spent. Government, parliament, scrutiny bodies, health ministries, education ministries, transport ministries, finance ministries, more effective and more accountable after a financial relationship with China or anyone else than they were before. Not just the short-term economic bump or social step forward, but the medium-term strengthening of state institutions, standing them in good stead to face whatever the uncertain future has to offer. My question to this conference is: how central is that purpose in China's development lending? How effectively is that objective being delivered? Is it being tested for, contemplated, measured? I wrote a book in 2008 called The Trouble with Aid: Why Less Could Mean More for Africa, still available. Less aid, less lending. Why? Because while grants and concessional loans can certainly do a lot of good in many contexts, their Achilles heel has been the undermining of public institutions, especially since the harmful and exaggerated doctrines of neoliberalism took hold, the so-called Washington Consensus, leading to the decimation of civil services around the world and a naive overconfidence in the private sector. And of course, now we are emerging finally from this neoliberal era, an ideology under which China never fell. And that's great, because now we're able to push a more balanced approach with a focus on industrial strategy, the centrality of the public sector, working in tandem with the private sector. But the problem with Western development aid in the 1980s and 90s wasn't just the wrong-headed policies. It was the hubristic way in which they were forced on debtor countries, undermining the fragile process of state building. And that was the key insight behind my book, and indeed a whole era of what was called aid effectiveness. The realization that aid and development was about helping to build a capable and accountable state apparatus. And the principles that I want to emphasize in this talk that I think are critical to successful development cooperation, including development lending, in the 21st century, and which are based on decades of evidence and research, which I think should influence the Chinese approach and everyone's approach to development lending, are these: humility, accountability, harmonization. Not quite harmony, which I know is a central concept in Chinese culture. There may be some overlap. Humility, accountability, harmonization. The surge of Chinese development lending in the past 2 decades has transformed the development landscape, the fight against poverty, global cooperation, international relations. Firstly, of course, the simple quantity of the money now available to support development in the global south. China almost rivals the World Bank in the size of its lending capacity, and of course has had a strong focus on infrastructure, transportation, energy, telecommunications, massively boosting investment in these sectors, neglected somewhat by Western aid. As important, in my view, as the sheer quantity of lending has been the rebalancing of the financing ecosystem, where once it was almost exclusively the domain of Western-dominated institutions, which were, of course, actively pushing a simplistic set of economic policies on debtors, which often did much more harm than good. The arrival of China as a major player allowed countries breathing space to adopt alternative pathways. Now, Chinese lending is complex, and I can't go into all the various aspects, obviously that would take too long. In this talk, I want to focus on the strengthening of public institutions, because I think China could play a crucial role, blazing a trail in supporting not just national public institutions, but international institutions, regional and global, which of course today are needed more than ever. This is, in my view, the next major evolution for Chinese development lending and spending. And can I just emphasize that I've spent most of my career critiquing Western approaches to development cooperation. So any criticism here of China is in no way because I think China somehow uniquely needs to improve. It's simply that this is a conference on the Chinese approach, so my remarks are focused in that direction. Let's start with humility. That might sound like a principle that's not very common to hear in a forum like this, but it's central to everything. The fundamental problem of the Western-dominated aid era has been a lack of ownership in recipient countries. The power resided in the lenders because they had the money, and that power translated into the imposition of policies and approaches that the lenders thought appropriate, regardless of what the governments and peoples of borrower countries thought. And actually, when we look at the Chinese approach to lending, we see that the Chinese do not suffer from the same hubristic confidence in their own policy solutions. In China's own development process, the most rapid industrialization in history, China itself didn't presume to have all the answers, quite the contrary. It adopted an approach of trial and error, learning from what worked. You could argue that in place of hubris, China was humble about development policy. And I'm not suggesting overall that China is a humble country, it certainly isn't. But humility in economic policy has served it well over the past few decades. And it brings the same instincts to its relationships with other countries in the global south. It does not preach, it supports. Very wise, and a key aspect of effective development lending. Not only will this approach lead to better policies, it will also lead to a strengthened state apparatus, as governments and peoples are able to learn from their own successes and failures, just like China has. Development is a marathon, not a sprint. So far, so good. But on my other two principles, Chinese development lending is not doing so well. Accountability is crucial for state building because it fosters a direct relationship between the government and its citizens, which is essential for sustainable development. When governments are accountable to their people, they're more likely to implement effective policies, gain public trust. Knowledge is power, and development is empowerment. When large amounts of money are available from abroad and can be managed unaccountably, that can reduce the importance of domestic revenue, such as taxes, undermining the social contract between governments and citizens. And of course, it can also entrench corruption. Currently, and despite some improvements in some countries, Chinese development lending is characterized by a lack of transparency, with terms not fully disclosed to the public. This opaqueness in Chinese lending causes great mistrust and fuels perceptions of predatory lending, even when this isn't the case. When parliaments and journalists and communities do not know the details of what their governments are up to, when even other ministries are in the dark about major financial deals, the gradual process of institutional strengthening, which I'm arguing is central to development, is undermined. And so development can be reversed, even as it appears that economic strides forwards are being made. This lack of accountability, lack of transparency, also makes it harder to manage debt crises, such as the ones many countries are living through today, which brings me to my third principle, harmonization. Allow me to share a story that I think is relevant here. In 2009, just 1,200 kilometers east of where you're sitting, there was a big conference on aid and development effectiveness in Busan, South Korea. I was there. I was actually a journalist at the time and I was covering all the goings on. And the big issue dominating the meeting was China. Was China going to sign up to the new covenant, the new set of principles governing how money should be spent and lent? All sorts of diplomatic overtures were made and eventually news came through on the last day of the conference that yes, China was in. So we were told. Cue a sense of success. But as we walked out of the conference centre, I turned to a great expert on aid effectiveness who'd really drafted the famous Paris Principles. And I asked whether he was excited by the conference outcomes. And his response? Paris is dead. The whole thing is over. Such an odd perspective, I thought at the time. But he was totally right. He saw that trying to bring China on board in that political moment was not going to work. The movement for development effectiveness was not ready to manage this thematically complicated and politically complex expansion of its remit. Gradually, despite the best efforts of many, over the next few years, the Paris process on aid effectiveness, this attempt to keep lenders honest, to pressure them to pursue the most effective approaches, not just the easy ones, began to dissipate, and now it hardly exists at all. In fact, in the past few years, we've seen a proliferation of new actors in the development finance ecosystem, making life that much harder for government and ministries that are already stretched to really manage effectively loans and other external finance in a coherent way. But harmonization, different lenders working together, sharing information, coordinating, simplifying procedures, seeking solutions together, is as important as it has ever been. With so much debt distress across the world, harmonization between the various players is crucial if countries are going to emerge from debt problems and start to thrive again. And that's why I think China now has a great opportunity to help build a new approach, building on what it does best and learning lessons from its own experience and from the Western experience of lending, not joining an OECD-led process, which was always a non-starter, but building a genuinely global approach to effectiveness. So what next? What does China need to do? Well, I think China needs to take a leadership position on institutional strengthening both nationally and internationally. Nationally, it needs to have clear institutional strengthening objectives, and it needs to measure whether it's achieving them. Otherwise, it runs the risk, like so many lenders before it, of lending billions, of indebting countries, but without embedding long-term development. In a paper I published with Mariana Mazzucato in October at the Biodiversity COP here in Colombia, called Global Public Investment for Global Missions, our co-author Daniel Ortega Pacheco reviewed recent debt swaps and set out recommendations for future debt swaps. They fit clearly into the case I'm making here. Ensure local governments and communities have a majority voice in debt swaps, with equitable representation for national and international stakeholders. Full public disclosure of deal structures from the pre-buyback phase through to the post-buyback management of funds. Incorporate third-party audits and evaluations to ensure that all actors, including private creditors, are held accountable for delivering on both fiscal and development goals. Engage local communities early in the planning process and ensure that their livelihoods are protected. And China also needs to lead at the international level. We're living in a period when global institutions are being rethought, challenged, remade, in part as a consequence of the geopolitical upheaval caused by China's rise and other power shifts in the global south. We need to gradually evolve our global financial ecosystem so that it is appropriate to the 21st century, balancing contribution and decision-making, risk and responsibility. All, I insist, under those three key principles: humility, accountability and harmonization. And the financing for development process coming up next year could be one of the important spaces where such an initiative could land. For some years I've been working with a group of experts and advocates on a new approach to lending and spending called Global Public Investment, which shifts us from a donor-recipient model and brings in a model where all countries will contribute, all benefit and all decide when it comes to investments in common global objectives, particularly global public goods. And I wrote a book about that as well, The Future of Aid, Global Public Investment, still available. This is about shifting our development ecosystem into a new era, but it's not about ideology or grandstanding, and it's not a nice to have. It's about effectiveness. And let me end just by briefly saying why this matters to China. First and most obviously, China wants its lending to work because of its solidarity with other countries in the global south. But furthermore, because international stability, peace and prosperity are a basic contextual requirement for China's continued remarkable economic journey. And effective lending with strong results in terms of more capable and more accountable governance and public institutions is, the evidence suggests, the most likely way of getting that global stability. So in this difficult moment for global affairs, in which China is taking an ever-increasing role in international development, it's time for the next evolution in Chinese development lending, a focus on building effective and accountable public institutions. Thanks for listening. Wishing you the best for the rest of your conference.